let's jump in. I know we're in already. Chapter 1, we learn a little bit about about Victor's past. He's got this adopted sister, Elizabeth. We get on page 17 that when the parents, Alphonse and Caroline Frankenstein, go to pick out Elizabeth, they see that she's different from the others, and so this shows us that romantic interest in ethnicity. Page 17, she appeared of different stock. The 4 others were dark-eyed, hardy little vagrants. This child was thin and very fair. Her hair was the brightest living gold, and despite the poverty of her clothing, seemed to set a crown of distinction on her head. Her brow was clear and ample, her blue eyes cloudless, and her lips and the molding of her face so expressive of sensibility and sweetness that none could behold her without looking on her as of a distinct species, a being heaven-sent and bearing a celestial stamp in all her features. The idea here is that we can just tell by looking at her, there's something different about her. She doesn't look like those hardy little vagrants, right? She has an ethnicity that shows something of heaven in her. And this is not what this class is about, but the extension of this romantic idea about ethnicity is the early 20th century idea of race, that some races are just sort of inherently better than others, and that there is in fact a master race. It sounds crazy, but there's a reason that those Germans in the early 20th century loved Wagner and very romantic notions of what Germany was. Okay, it has a beginning here. Let's go to chapter 2. We meet Henry Clerval, who's Victor's friend. Clerval is, of course, also got this kind of interesting backstory. You notice when you read this book, the elevated language. There is a kind of romance. And by romantic, you should know, of course, we don't just mean like two people fall in love. We mean romantic like you romanticize a situation. Like instead of remembering things as they were, you remember them in this kind of elevated sense. That's what this book is full of. You know about Clerval, and you know that what Victor decides early on is that his romantic quest, his genius is going to be in what he calls natural philosophy. We would call those the sciences. And he says at the bottom of 21 that he's not going to search for wealth. He's not going to search for a kind of a material thing, but for glory. If he could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death. So he is going to distinguish himself by eliminating disease and overcoming death. Of course, then the very next page or 2 pages over, his mother Caroline dies, sort of fuels that fire in him. And of course, when the mom dies, her last wish is for Victor and Elizabeth to get together, which they're adopted siblings. That seems odd to us. This is a good place to bring up a term, the Gothic. Right? The Gothic is an offshoot of Romanticism. Maybe it's kind of like the logical conclusion of a certain kind of Romanticism. The Gothic we know about from like Edgar Allan Poe, The Fall of the House of Usher. You are familiar with Gothic just as a term for people who, like, at least when I was in high school, they wore black clothes and they had very pale faces, and they were, you know, like very emotional lives was the idea. Gothic here means, in literature, Gothic is a descriptor for books that are poetry, works that deal with decay, with darkness, with strong emotions, but always negative emotions. There's always ruins involved. A lot of the family situations are always a little bit ambiguous. Are they together? Are they not together? And that's just a sign of this decaying or this decline of these great old houses, like in The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. You guys doing okay? I see we're at about 15 minutes. We'll do about 5 or 10 more minutes and then we'll be done. Okay, he goes off to school. It's important that he's kind of self-taught. I think you should know about that. And what we see really early on is that he figures this out. He cracks the code. On page 31, he says, "After days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life." That's not bad. "I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter." So he has cracked the code, and he's going to actually be able to take a thing that is inanimate and make it animate. He's going to be able to take a thing that's dead and make it come back to life. Obviously, this is like a supernatural thing, right? We're no longer in the world of the Enlightenment, where we know that that doesn't happen. We've all experienced the loss of something that was alive. Maybe your goldfish, maybe your dog, maybe someone that you loved. And we all know that there is no bringing back. But this is not the Enlightenment, right? This is Romanticism. So this is this kind of hyper emotional sort of like fantasy about what science can do. And there's lots in these pages about Cornelius Agrippa, which you should read on your own. Okay. He gets away with not having to tell us. This is pretty clever stuff by Shelley. She doesn't have to tell us the secret, because at the bottom of 31, he says, if I told you this, then it would ruin your life too. But we know from Scooby-Doo and all the movies that you just hook up the dead thing to the lightning, and then you flip the switch and it comes to life. On page 33, 35, what we see is that he creates his creature out of like spare parts. He goes to the charnel houses, which is like where churches store bones, and he gets bones from there. He goes to the dissection rooms, which I guess would be like a medical school or something. And then he talks about the slaughterhouse. I'm not sure what's going on there, but he builds this creature out of dead stuff, dead things. Here we should say, and if we were in class, we would talk about this, but we talked about it a little bit, but there is this myopic focus, this singular goal that he's about. I'm going to do this thing. And in doing this thing, he ignores everything else, even the downsides to doing this thing. This would be the place for the lesson on the meaningful life. What does it mean to be so focused on the one thing that we don't see everything else that is around us? We talked about this in class, and you guys had lots of interesting things to say about it. Let's go to page 35. He sparks the thing, then he sees it. He doesn't see what it really is before he makes it. He makes it, and then he sees it. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom from such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The thing didn't really have a chance. He's made from these old dead parts. Even if he's animated, he's never going to be like attractive. This is going to come back to bite him, just how awful he is. And then Victor does the first of many, many times in this story where he just does the thing that makes you want to strangle him. After the thing comes to life, Victor splits. It wore me out. I took a nap. So he's there in his bed taking a nap, and the creature comes to him. Bottom of 35. He held up the curtain of the bed. Of course, Victor is a guy who sleeps in one of those beds with the curtains. His eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on me. His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me. But I escaped and rushed downstairs. Obviously, we could see this as a threat. There is a thing. It's ugly. It's coming at Victor. Yeah. You could also see this thing, though, as, let me just reframe it for you. It's newly born. It's helpless. It's reaching out. Help me, he seems to be saying, like a baby, right? And that's not an accident. We should see here the story of Mary Shelley, young 19-year-old Mary Shelley, who had given birth to stillborn babies, who had lost several babies. And remember, the spark of this story is that she had her baby, she took it to the fire, and the baby was reanimated. So there is also in here a kind of like image of Victor as parent and Creature as child. This is probably a good place to stop, and we'll just finish by saying this: science fiction and fantasy stories are asking the exact same questions all of our other stories are, and that is, what does it mean to be a human being? You know, like Star Trek, it has like Spock, who's a Vulcan, or it has like Data, who's a robot. Well, those people are just asking, what does it mean to be a human being? This story